Thank you very much, and hello and welcome everyone to this session on regulation and the state. And it follows on really quite nicely from the keynote that Alan Rushbridger has just given, I think, where we ended talking about the Leveson inquiry. Alan also mentioned the issues to do with the Edward Snowden story and the wholesale surveillance from GCHQ and NSA, and where the government of the day ordered the Guardian to hand over files and stop publishing its contents. So we can see that there's a very difficult relationship often between a newspaper, the Guardian in particular, and the state, and also regulation, particularly when talking about regulation of the media itself. You all know me, I think by now. I'm Natalie Fenton at Goldsmiths and chair of the Media Reform Coalition. We have a brilliant panel of speakers who will present in the order I'm introducing them. They'll each speak for 15 minutes, and that should leave us a good 30 minutes for discussion. And as in all of the other sessions, please keep the chat active, keep your questions coming, and we'll be collecting them as we go along. So our first speaker today will be Julian Petley. Julian's an honorary professor at Brunel University and the author and editor of many books, including Culture Wars, The Media and the British Left with James Curran and Ivor Gaber, and co-editor of Pointing the Finger, Islam and Muslims in the British Media with Robin Richardson. The title of Julian's paper is, quote, "There's no need to write anymore," unquote, The Guardian and Edward Snowden. Next on the agenda is Brian Cathcart. He's a former journalist at The Independent, Reuters and New Statesman, and author of many books, including the award-winning The Case of Stephen Lawrence in 1999, The News from Waterloo in 2014. He founded Hacked Off back in 2011, is a professor of journalism at Kingston University. Brian's speaking to a paper on the Guardian and press reform, A Wheel Come Full Circle. And finally, Simon Dawes is a lecturer at l'Université de Versailles in Saint-Quentin-en-Yvelines in France. I'm sure I've said that all wrong. He's founding editor of the open access journal Media Theory, the author of British Broadcasting and the Public-Private Dichotomy, Neoliberalism, Citizenship and the Public Sphere, and co-editor of Neoliberalism in Context, Governance, Subjectivity and Knowledge. And he's speaking today on media freedom, power, and the public, all topics very close to my heart. Please note to anyone who's just arrived that the session is being recorded. And Julian, I'm going to hand immediately straight over to you. Can everybody else please make sure they're muted? I'm going to turn my camera off, and when I turn it on, Julian, as I've said, you're coming to the end of your time.
On earth. Right.
Over to you.
Thanks very much, Natalie. Well, yeah, Alan's talk really does lead very neatly into mine. I'm going to talk about the Snowden affair, and in particular about the press attacks on the Guardian over the Snowden business. As Alan reminded us, back in June 2013, the Guardian was forced to destroy the computer equipment on which some of this information was held. It was completely pointless, of course, since it was all available elsewhere. But although I think the Guardian was given absolutely no option but to destroy that equipment by the government, the very fact that the Guardian had allowed the equipment to be destroyed was repeatedly taken as evidence by politicians and other newspapers that what that equipment contained was illegal, that the paper knew it was illegal, and that it was highly damaging to national security. So the attack that started off in round about June 2013 went on and on for months. Now, of course, as I'm sure many of you know, that during this period, most British newspapers had been loudly and incessantly complaining, as they'd done right from the start of the Leveson inquiry in July 2011, about the grave danger of what they called statutory control of the press. So they might have been expected, mightn't they, to have sprung to the defence of the Guardian, but not at all. Instead, the Mail, the Sun and the Telegraph, along with the Weekly Spectator, did their absolute utmost to undermine the paper, to attack the paper, and to bolster the government's case. And I'm going to give you some examples of what they did under three headings, really. The first heading is Payback for Leveson. The second heading is the BBC and the liberal elite. And the third heading is national security. Alan writes about this in his book, Breaking News. It's on pages 326 to 328. And I've written an article about it in the journal Ethical Space. If anybody wants me to send that to them, you can contact me via email via the Brunel website, and I'll happily do so. I mean, a lot of people don't read the right-wing British press, and frankly, who can blame them? So I think it's worth my while in this short talk, just giving you some examples of the tenor of the campaign in the pages of the Mail in particular, actually, against the paper. So Alan does quote this in his book, but so let's start, I think most importantly of all, with payback for Leveson. But this is a really strong theme. So we turn to the Mail and an article by their columnist Stephen Glover on the 21st of August. And I will just read some of these quotes out. He says, and I quote, "The paper is, of course, almost single-handedly responsible for Leveson because of its later debunked allegation that the News of the World deleted the voicemails of the murdered schoolgirl Millie Dowler." That's not true, by the way. It wasn't debunked. Anyway, unquote. And he argues, again, quote, "The newspaper has shed copious tears for Mr. Miranda, held for 9 hours, but had no such concerns over the interrogation of dozens of red-top journalists," unquote. Again, in his view, quote, "Even the most culpable among them never attempted to damage their country. With friends like Edward Snowden and employees such as Glenn Greenwald, that is what the Guardian is in danger of doing." So then 2 days later, there was a Mail editorial entitled "Whiff of Hypocrisy," and this argued, quote, "Press freedom is an essential right in any democratic society, but along with rights come responsibilities. The Guardian continues to be vociferous in its demands for police to pursue tabloid journalists suspected of acting illegally. Is the paper so arrogant and hypocritical as to believe it is itself above the law?" Unquote. Rhetorical question, expecting the answer, yes, obviously. Following day, similar piece in The Spectator. The article was headed, "The Guardian didn't care when Murdoch's journalists were arrested, so why the hysteria now?" Then turning to The Sun, we find Rod Liddell, it's the 10th of October. There's an article headed, "Guardian Treason Helping Terrorists." And he argues in this one, "This is the newspaper which has encouraged the state control of the British press, a publication which has allied itself with the Hacked Off campaign to restrict the freedom of what we in the press can and can't report. It was particularly pious about the handful of cases in which journalists and other papers hacked the phones of members of the public in order to get stories. The phone hacking was unquestionably wrong, but it doesn't compare to what the Guardian has done." I could give you lots of other examples of what I call payback, but I'm not going to do that because there's too much of it. So the next one is really, this is attacking two birds with one stone. This is the Daily Mail attacking two of its favourite enemies. One is the hated Liberal Guardian, the other is the hated Liberal BBC. And I thought this was worth focusing on now because, of course, in more recent times, the attacks on the BBC have only been, more massively stepped up, particularly, of course, in the Daily Mail, whose editor-in-chief, Paul Dacre, is now being touted as the possible head of Ofcom, one of whose jobs would be to regulate, yes, of course, the BBC. So this is actually quite important. And it also has a bearing on something else that many of us are interested in, which is the way in which press and broadcasting news agendas both coincide and fail to coincide. What the Mail is doing here, interestingly, it's attacking the BBC for not following its news agenda. And I think that's really quite important. So what happened was that I think on the 9th of October, the new head of MI5, Andrew Parker, gave a speech in which he attacked the Guardian over the Snowden revelations. And the Mail gave a huge amount of space to this speech. And I think it probably interviewed Parker as well, if I remember correctly. But what it then complained about was that the BBC hadn't given enough coverage to what Parker had said. And it was in one of the editorials that the paper ran around about this time against the Guardian that particularly angered Alan Rusbridger. This was the editorial headed "The Paper That Helps Britain's Enemies." So let me just again quote to you a little bit from what it said, because I say it manages to attack both the Guardian and the BBC all in one go. So quote, "It's impossible to imagine a graver charge against a newspaper than that has given succor to our country's enemies and endangered all our lives by handing terrorists the gift they need to evade us and strike at will. Yet so said Andrew Parker in his first speech as our spy chief, which yesterday was significantly endorsed by Number 10. So isn't it staggering that the BBC could hardly bring itself for much of yesterday to report Mr. Parker's devastating indictment of the Guardian? The problem is that a wall of prejudice surrounds Broadcasting House, a belief that the right merits relentless attack, while the BBC's soulmates on the liberal left must always be protected. Again, Stephen Glover contributes an article on the same day making very much the same point. I won't bother to read it out. There are two other news stories. Well, they call themselves news stories, but they're views stories in the same day. I'll just give you the headline. It's a very long headline, but one of them is headed "PM backs spy chief's attack on Guardian. The security expert warned leaks risk widespread loss of life, but BBC buries criticism of left-wing paper," unquote. The other is headed "How the BBC Buried the Story. MI5 attack on left-wing papers leaks played down." Again, I could give you more examples, but I won't do so. Well, I'll move on to the final category of attacks around this notion of national security. For the Sun, the Mail, the Telegraph, and I mentioned the Spectator too, it really seems to be axiomatic that Snowden's revelations in the Guardian or via the Guardian irreparably damaged national security. So in their pages, skeptical or dissenting sources are very rarely quoted, and pronouncement by government ministers and security chiefs, as they're habitually called, are taken entirely at face value. And from such a perspective, it's thus perfectly acceptable for newspapers to give large amounts of uncontested space to those calling for the prosecution of other journalists, and indeed to do so themselves. I mean, it's one thing to report politicians calling for the prosecution of journalists. It's quite another, in my view, to run editorials demanding that. Again, the Mail obviously looms very, very large here. Here's a headline, 8th of October. "The Guardian has produced a handbook that will help fanatics strike at will." That's one. And Stephen Glover again crops up, complaining, again I'm quoting, that Alan Rusbridger is a newspaper man, not a security expert. "The high-handedness is amazing. Mr. Rusbridger thinks he can determine which stories might harm national security and which will not. According to the experts, he is hopelessly unqualified to make such a judgment." Now, again, I don't need to go on about this. This stuff, in my view, is poisonous crap, but I think actually people do need to hear at least some of it. It gives you an indication of what is there. And, you know, it seems that the moment the magic words national security are uttered, then in these newspapers, all skepticism, all, you know, idea of the fourth estate just flies completely out of the window. In any other democratic country, politicians threatening journalists would immediately be the subject of stories, an indignant comment in most newspapers. But in Britain, the threats are made not only by politicians, but by the newspapers themselves. But unfortunately, there's nothing new about this. If we look back into the history of stories in which national security has been allegedly a threat, we will find that most newspapers have actually taken the government's side. I'm thinking about the ABC show trial, the BBC series Secret Society, the BBC programme Edge of the Union, and so on and so forth. So the press has always, in these cases, taken the government's side. And I'm going to end with a quote from Jonathan Friedland in The Guardian, because again, I think it relates very strongly to something which is going on now, the debate which is going on now about national, about sovereignty, this idea of sovereignty. Friedland wrote a piece saying, you know, if this attack was going on in the States, you know, newspapers would be rushing to the defense of a paper like The Guardian, and newspapers would be much more concerned about what, you know, the NSA in the States was actually doing. Whereas over here, even those papers that didn't really attack The Guardian didn't seem particularly interested in the NSA, in the revelations about GCHQ and NSA. So to end on my quote from Friedland, he said, Britons have no such starting assumptions. The people are not sovereign here. They never have been. We speak of parliamentary, not popular sovereignty. We're used to power flowing from the top down, from the centre outward, and most of the time we accept it. We act as if it's natural for the state to be in charge, and it's an act of generosity when it deigns to let in a little daylight. If an arm of the state insists on total secrecy, this seems reasonable to Brits in a way few Americans would ever accept. It's not a natural instinct for Britons to see, say, GCHQ as their employees. So an interesting point there, I think, to end on. Since the debate about sovereignty has been going on, and since you might argue that the British press, for the most part, has shown remarkable lack of interest in the scandals and disgraceful behaviour conducted by this government since it came to power. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Julian. I've got a weird echo, so maybe I'll stop talking and go straight over to Brian. We're going to go from talking about oppressions around media freedom to problems with media power. So Brian, over to you. Oh, we can't hear you. You're muted. Brian, you need to unmute.
I'm muted, and now I'm unmuted. Yes, sorry about that. There's always one, isn't there? Right. So I'm interested in press regulation and have been a campaigner in this field for a dozen years or more. I'm conscious that we're this year marking the 10th anniversary of the crisis of, as well as the 200th birthday of The Guardian, but the 10th anniversary of the beginning of the Leveson inquiry. It's slipping into history. And this is a very important moment in the history of The Guardian. And I wanted, as this anniversary approached, to revisit The Guardian's role in the Leveson crisis and what followed, because obviously it's a milestone in Guardian history, it's a milestone in the history of journalism in this country, but also because it is, I think, the subject of some misconceptions and was something that would benefit from a little scrutiny with a little hindsight. And I'm conscious here that, you know, I was a participant in the issues and the events which were involved. I was the director of one of the founders, and I was the director of Hacked Off. So what I did was, for a piece in the current issue of the Political Quarterly, I recommend it, was to revisit the leading articles of The Guardian of the period, and also its submissions to the Leveson inquiry, and also some of its other public statements. And my mission really was to establish what went wrong, because The Guardian, and we've been reminded of it this morning, was the pioneering paper that broke ranks with the rest of the national press to expose phone hacking. And it was a cataclysmic exposure. I mean, it rocked government. It resulted in the closure of the News of the World, and it's still being felt today as two newspaper groups continue to pay compensation to victims of hacking, who number in their legion, shall we say. Why did The Guardian not commit itself to the outcome of this this crisis? Why did The Guardian not engage with the recommendations of the Leveson inquiry? Now, I can't really answer those questions. They're in other people's heads, I suspect, the answers. But I can tell you what the negatives are. And to explain what I mean by that, when you talk to people about this, particularly from The Guardian, or when you read in The Guardian about Leveson, if you thumb back, or indeed if you look at Alan Rusbridger's Breaking News memoir, you'll find a trail of reasons, of arguments, of cases for departing from the Leveson recommendations and the Royal Charter path that emerged from it. My examination of the, I mean, I kind of felt it at the time, but my examination of the editorials and other documentation for the Political Quarterly argument suggested to me that, in fact, none of those really stands up. So let me just run through them. Why did The Guardian not engage with the Leveson reforms of regulation? Because statute, because it was statutory, because it was, you know, and that's a traditional anathema for British journalists. Well, no, actually, The Guardian argued very cogently through the Leveson inquiry that use of statute of the kind that was ultimately adopted was perfectly legitimate. It was not inimical to free journalism. Because the political agreement that emerged ultimately with the Royal Charter, etc., was a kind of behind closed doors fix involving, you know, shifty negotiations between politicians who should have nothing to do with press regulation. Well, again, if you look at The Guardian's leaders and its arguments at the time, actually, it came to accept. It didn't like the way in which the negotiations were conducted, but actually, it came to accept them. And it particularly towards the end, when it was a bit more open and there was a bit more public tug of war about these issues, it was content that the process had ultimately proved satisfactory. Because it employed Royal Charter, that's another one. Royal Charter is kind of a ridiculous process which involves stand-up meetings of the Privy Council with the Queen and things being inscribed on vellum. It's fundamentally undemocratic. Yeah, it is. But look back into The Guardian of 2013 and you will see that it accepted that this was the least worst solution to the problem, accompanied as it was by a little statutory underpinning to say that this particular charter couldn't be meddled with by politicians. The Guardians explicitly accepted that this was an adequate solution. Because, and this is the last of them really, because it used court costs in libel as leverage for participation in a recognized regulator. So this is the process by which if newspapers became engaged in libel litigation, infamously, they might find themselves having to pay the costs of somebody who sued them, even if the newspaper won. Now, this was a device introduced by Leveson to lever newspapers into a recognized regulation system, which offered an arbitration service as an alternative to the courts, much cheaper, much cheaper. Leveson wanted it to be free, actually. First of all, The Guardian, at the core of its submissions to Leveson, again and again, wanted arbitration. It wanted an arbitral arm, as it put it. And secondly, it explicitly accepted the idea that people might have to pay costs in cases they won. It explicitly accepted that as a part of the package. It's actually not that unusual in other walks of life. So the kind of run through of the arguments, the casual arguments that we hear today about why Leveson was a bad idea, these were not accepted by The Guardian in 2013. On the contrary, Leveson gave The Guardian precisely what it wanted, or certainly as close to what it wanted as any reasonable participant in the process could have expected. The Guardian didn't join a Leveson standard regulator, as I've said, as we know. It never produced a clear reason for backing away from the deal. Those are kind of arguments that have flowed since. At the time, it didn't give a clear reason for backing away. If you look at Breaking News, Alan Rusbridger's memoir, you'll see there is an account of a meeting with what he described as one of the elders of the industry. In fact, there's a theme of pressure from the industry on the Guardian to as it were, to toe the industry line. There's a line where somebody says to him, "If you don't do what we want, then I wouldn't want to be in your shoes." And this person is not named. Now, if that's obviously never been expressed as the Guardian's position, nor really did Alan Rusbridger state it as his explicit reason for departing. He deployed many of the arguments I have mentioned, which don't actually fit with what the Guardian said in 2013. I think there's a problem here of history being rewritten, and there's a problem of openness and frankness. We don't know what the Guardian, why the Guardian recoiled from it, but it is a decision that isn't just a kind of matter of history or a matter of the the declining world of print newspapers. This is a matter which has current relevance. It is significant today that we do not have effective independent press regulation affecting national newspapers today. If the Guardian had joined, it is possible. It's not certain, but it is possible that it could have precipitated a drift in the press towards effective independent regulation. The Independent might have joined, who knows, the FT might have joined, others might have flowed in behind, ultimately seeing that it worked. Who knows? It's arguable. But what is not disputable here is that the Guardian placed itself on the wrong side of the argument. Over time, it departed from the Leveson argument. And in fact, the title of my paper is The Wheel Come Full Circle. It came to be an enemy of the Leveson system and an enemy of press reform of the kind that Leveson offered. And you see that nowhere more clearly than in the Guardian's approach to Leveson II. When the crisis came in 2017 and 2018, the Guardian came out against the second phase of the Leveson inquiry. Now, pause for a moment. This was an inquiry into criminality in the press and associated criminality in the police. It was also, going to reopen some of the issues addressed by Leveson I because there was no closure. So what are we looking at here? We're looking at the Guardian overturning something that it had precipitated and that was a very serious issue for the public and for the press. And I don't want to capture or seize Alan Rusbridger's hostages to fortune in his speech earlier, in his address earlier, but he did say that the Guardian was set up after Peterloo to find the truth, to find agreed facts, that it was impossible to move on. Now, he wasn't editor at the time in 2017 and 18. He does not bear responsibility. But the Guardian's posture in that period is extraordinary. It is both a betrayal of what went before. It's certainly a betrayal of the press victims who had put trust in the Guardian, and in very practical ways. But it's also a betrayal of the victims of press abuse who continue to suffer to this day as a result of the absence of effective independent regulation. And just to give you a measure of the kind of shallowness of what we're talking about, the Guardian's key leader on the subject of Leveson II contained the line, Leveson II would ultimately end up like a driver learning to steer by looking in the rearview mirror at the road, looking in the rearview mirror at the road behind rather than the one ahead. Now, that is, set that beside the idea that the Guardian was set up to find the truth about or expose the truth about Peterloo. It's a preposterous position for a national newspaper. I'll leave it there, Natalie.
Thank you very much, Brian. And so, Simon, we're going to move over to you. If anybody's joined in the meantime, please note we're asking questions at the end. Simon's the final speaker. So please keep adding your questions in the chat and I will be scooping them all up to have a discussion finally. So Simon, we're turning to you to pull all of the threads seamlessly together to talk about media freedom, power and the public. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. And thanks very much to Felix as well for being my lovely assistant with the PowerPoints. If we can go on to the next slide then to look at the outline of what I'll talk about. I'm using this idea of what I call media freedom events, which builds on a traditional concept that's used in media studies, media events, and links it with debates on media freedom. And what I'm arguing is that the News of the World phone hacking scandal and the way that the Guardian investigated it and the subsequent Leveson inquiry and the criminal courts, criminal trials, and all of the debates that we had about media freedom, what it is, whether there should be limits on it, what's the role of the media, whether the status quo of regulation should be defended or not. All of these things constitute what I call a media freedom event. And we saw like bad media freedom in the sense of what the News of the World was doing, and good media freedom in the sense of what the Guardian was doing. But I'm also going to say what it reveals is questions of media power. So although we're talking about media freedom, what we're actually seeing is a demonstration of media power. The power, first of all, of something like the News of the World and the Murdoch press and the tabloids in general over the public and the way that they abuse the public, but also the power of the media in general, which includes the Guardian, for the very reasons that Brian just covered, in refusing to accept independent regulation. So I'm arguing that the Guardian are complicit and equally guilty as the News of the World, for encouraging this system of unaccountable power in the media. And instead, I'll be arguing that what we need to do instead is think more about the public. So when we're talking about media freedom, instead of fetishizing the media, in inverted commas, and the image we would have is the intrepid investigative reporter, but in reality what we're talking about is powerful people like Rupert Murdoch. Instead of fetishizing the media, we should be thinking about the media as representative of the public and thinking about the public more, and both about the freedom of the public from power, such as media power, and the ability of the public to hold power, including media power, to account. Okay, so next slide, please. So media events then originally comes from Diane and Katz, when they were talking much more about media events as a genre of national broadcasting, so a type of representation of the Queen's coronation and that kind of thing. And they argued that there were three different types. There was coronation, conquest, and contest, which deals with past, present, and future. And with the debates about media freedom around the phone hacking scandal, we can see the celebration of the 150 years or whatever of press freedom, how great it all was, how great the Guardian was in their investigative reporting, how potentially the fact that the truth came out and certain people went to prison and things like that showed that everything was fine, that status quo could be maintained, and fear about the future, what would happen if there was independent regulation in the future and how that would be the end of press freedom. And there were lots of different categories of what made something a media event, which have been adapted over time by lots of different people. So on to the next slide. So we can understand better the original concept of media events in terms of ritual media events following Hepp and Kotz, when they say that what such media events do is they ritually confirm the social rules and values within a nation or society. So they maintain the status quo, even if they're sometimes dealing with debates on the status quo, that they maintain the status quo, which again is what I'm arguing happened with the phone hacking scandal. There are lots of people who have talked about the difference between media events and media happenings. So media events are made to happen, happenings just happen, like a natural disaster. The difference between one event and a series of events or event chains. They've been applied to terrorism and disasters, people talking about multimedia media events and transnational media events. It's been increasingly theorized by people like Hepp and Nick Couldry, talking about media rituals and mediatization much more. And what I want to do is build on those kind of theoretical work on what a media event is by also looking at philosophy with people like Michel Foucault and Paul Virilio, who've talked about the event and what is an event. And I use media events in this way, which I'll show you a quote in a second. And I think that developing media events in this kind of way and applying it to media freedom and this idea of media freedom events is much more useful than addressing the phone hacking scandal in terms of a moral panic about the end of media freedom, or in terms of meta-journalism. So when journalists talk about journalism, when the media talk about the media. Next slide, please. So a useful quote from Nick Couldry is that for him, media events are large-scale, event-based, media-focused narratives where the claims associated with the myth of the mediated centre are particularly intense. So in my case, what I'm talking about is media freedom, and the extent to which we debate media freedom. There is a particular idea of media freedom and what it is, what the limits are, that is aggressively promoted or defended against certain attacks, which are also these critiques, these attacks are represented, but they're often shouted down. For Foucault, an event offers a privileged insight into relations of power, making visible both the ceremony of established power and its contestation. So it's this idea of event that I want to use and say that the phone hacking scandal as a media freedom event reveals these questions of power. It reveals that the influence of someone like Rupert Murdoch, but it also reveals the unaccountable power of even a newspaper like The Guardian, not just News of the World. Felix, next one. So if we add media freedom to that, It's much more a question of the media freedom focused narrative, these subjective ideological views of a particular interpretation of what media freedom is, which also makes visible these relations of power. Okay, and then move on to the next one. So what's important for me to look at is the way in which debates on the role of the media and how it should be regulated are presented in the media, often favouring a particular position, a particular take. The way in which this is actually constitutive of a certain form of media freedom, it's performative in a certain way. And I think this is important for understanding not just media freedom itself, but liberal democracy more generally. I think that liberal democracy is in a period of crisis at the moment. We're having lots of debates on very important aspects of liberal democracy, such as media freedom. So I think there are a lot more, there's more regularity, and there are more occurrences of such events where we start questioning everything that's been taken for granted for quite a while now. Felix? Next slide, please. Thanks. So there's lots of debates with things not just about media freedom, but about free speech, the free speech crisis, and cancel culture. So for me, when we talk about these kind of things all the time in the media, what they really are is expressions of power from those who already have a voice, who already have power, who have lots of platforms, who dominate the media and politics, and who have a very strong voice, getting very angry that they've been criticised by the kind of people who don't normally have a voice. So they tend to be right-wing, racist bigots who get very annoyed that there are some black people and transgender people and things like that criticising them. So they say, oh, it's the end of free speech, and it's cancel culture, political correctness gone mad, and things like that. So we have lots of these debates, and these terms get appropriated and used strategically by people to defend their own interests. So generally speaking, I think when you hear journalists telling you how important media freedom is, it doesn't necessarily mean that it is. It's journalists have a vested interest in defending media freedom. Felix? Okay, so I think it's important to look at the ways in which these terms are used increasingly at the moment. So, for example, Wendy Brown has argued that because of this crisis in liberal democracy, the terms of liberal democracy are used to justify the very opposite as a cloak for neoliberalism and an undermining of liberal democracy. So Natalie Fenton with Gavin Titley has talked about how ideals of publicness and the public sphere and by association media freedom and things like that, when we hear about them, when they're debated normally in the media, it tends to be a focus on things like the freedom to and the freedom from, or more critically, the power to and the power from. But we don't talk about the power over, so a more traditional understanding of power or domination, which is what we need to analyse more critically when we look at such instances. We need to think about the question of media power, which Des Friedman has written quite a lot about, and the role of these terms like media freedom in actually defending media power. Felix? Okay, so if we look at some of the claims that are made about media freedom, people argue that the media are important for democracy, that they're representative of the public and of public opinion, but obviously they also inform and influence or manipulate public opinion, and that they hold power to account on behalf of the public. So traditionally they hold state power to account, but they could also hold corporate power to account. But I think it's important to emphasize this on behalf of the public. And it's also important to look at the extent to which the media, sometimes the media are very close to state power, normally they're very close to corporate power, but the media themselves are sometimes the power that needs to be held to account by the public. So when that's the case, there's no point in fetishizing media freedom. We need to emphasize more the public. Next slide, please. So what was revealed with the News of the World phone hacking scandal was, first of all, the problems with having an unaccountable and unregulated press, as well as the absence of or ineffectiveness of privacy law in the UK and the extent of lobbying and all of those things. So the bad side of media freedom as it currently exists. But what we also saw was good media freedom in the sense of what the Guardian did with its investigative journalism, holding the news of the world to account, and the subsequent inquiries and trials, which showed us that all was well with liberal democracy, that actually everything's fine. And even though bad things happen, there'll be someone else like the Guardian to come in and sort everything out for us. So there's no need to rock the boat or change regulation according to these claims. Next slide. However, there were other issues. So the fact that the Guardian didn't join Impress and that there was no financial incentive for others to join, the fact that there wasn't a part 2 of Leveson and things like that, actually represents ultimately the failure of the public to use the weight of their experience and their opinion and turn that into actual regulation and to turn that into accountability of media power. So it's a failure to hold power to account in those terms. We need to look at whose interests are served by maintaining this unregulated press, or in the Guardian's case, the fact that they regulate themselves. So in many ways, it's even worse than the way in which the Sun, for example, is regulated. And whose interests are not served. So I would argue the public's, certainly the victims represented by Hacked Off and people like those, but more widely, the public in general. And we need to think about how to balance the voice of the press with the voice of the public. So stop fetishizing this view of the media, in inverted commas, and also talk about the media more as representative, having this representative democratic function, representing the public in the same way that Parliament represents the public. Okay, next slide. Okay, so ever since we've had media freedom, there have always been criticisms of media freedom within liberalism itself, but also from Marxists and others. And then from the mid-20th century, we had Jürgen Habermas talking about the public sphere, who's been very, very influential for critiquing the liberal theory of media freedom. The fundamental problem with the dominant view, this liberal view of media freedom, is that it puts all the hands in the private sector. So you have powerful individuals or corporate interests, and these private interests invade the public sphere and ultimately undermine it. So it's a problem at the heart of the liberal theory of media freedom. And more specifically, there are problems with the fact that the press is completely unregulated, or it's self-regulated, but it's meaningless. Honora O'Neill has talked about how it's important to distinguish between an individual's right to free expression, free speech, which is pretty much absolute, apart from the extent to which it infringes upon someone else's freedom, and the freedom of an institution, a media institution, such as a newspaper, often owned by incredibly powerful interests, with a huge influence on public opinion, and therefore the ability, if they have limitless free speech, and if they are completely unaccountable to the public or to anyone else, they can undermine democracy. So we need to also think about nuancing this individualization of free speech and media freedom. And also, normally when we talk about media freedom, we may have the image of the investigative journalist in our heads, but really what we're talking about are the proprietors and the shareholders and their freedom. I think we need to focus much more on the journalists as well as other employees of the media and think more about protecting their freedom. But we also need to think about the media as representative of the public. So think about the freedom of the public, especially when the media are the power which is in conflict with the media. Thank you. Final slide. So what I want to do is reframe media freedom, rethink media freedom, less in terms of this libertarian absolutist view, which fetishizes certain power and makes invisible the power of people like Murdoch. Instead of, we need to critique the media's power over the public and emphasize much more the public's freedom from the media, from media power. So stop the media invading everyone's privacy and things like that. Stop the media stigmatizing certain communities within the public and things like that. We also need to think about less about the media's freedom from public accountability, as if that is somehow the do-all and end-all, the be-all and end-all of media freedom, and think more about the public's power over the media and their ability to hold the media to account. So it's more about emphasizing the freedom and power of the public rather than the freedom and power of the media, in inverted commas, which is linked to some things that I've written about and Tom Mills and Dan Hind have written about, particularly in the context of British broadcasting, criticizing the extent to which it's ever really been about the public, saying we need to think more about the public, make the public more involved, more active, give the public more of a voice. But I think, not saying that we should have public service press or anything like that, but we need to think about media freedom as representative of the public, and therefore give a bigger role to the public rather than this fetishization of the media, and this image of the journalist which actually hides the reality, which is very powerful and nasty influences behind so-called media freedom. Okay, that's me finished. Thank you very much, Felix, for your help.
Thank you very much, Simon. So we now have a good half an hour for discussion, which is fantastic. And there have been a range of things being batted around in the chat in relation to what people are saying. I think what we've got, or what's been very neatly set out in this panel, is that it's all about power and different types of power, that we have state power on the one hand, which can really restrict the freedom of journalists in particular ways and the freedom of media, but we also have media power, and it's the complex relations as to when at any one point when either of those gets out of control or steps over the mark. And I think putting the public at the heart of it, as Simon was saying, is absolutely key. And if we did that, I wonder how very different things would be. I wonder how very different if we'd approached it from a position of giving the public more power, how Leveson would have worked out and the regulation of the press. I wonder how different it would have been in how we approached things like the reporting of Ed Snowden. It would have been an entirely different understanding. And of course, really, in some ways, coming at it from an entirely different society. We don't do that. So when we hear in Alan Rusbridger's talk this morning about the purpose being public service, that to me raises a really big question, is who's public? In which public's interest are we talking? When people, it's almost like to me where we can talk about media freedom and we can talk about public service, but we don't really interrogate what that is, what the meaning of the public is. And so I would like to ask each of the panelists first to reflect on that idea, is how do we define what that public is or could be in that? Because I think that is the key to unlocking so much of what's been discussed. So maybe first, in the order presented, Julian. Unmute, Julian.
Is it okay now? Can you hear me?
We can.
All right. So, as somebody who's written a lot about public service broadcasting, I think it's a very important question. I think of, the ideal kind of public really here as an informed public. The problem is that in this country, not least because of the kind of press we've got, the notion of the public all too easily tips over into the notion of the people. And that's a very populist notion and a very different kind of notion. So you need an informed public, but of course, this is a bit of a chicken and egg situation here, because one way you get an informed public is having an informed media, a media that informs people. A lot of our media doesn't do that. So I think we have to think about the notion here of informed publics.
Yes, thank you, Julian. Of course, that's an endless conundrum, how you do informed publics in that way, and who's doing the informing of the publics and representing which publics on whose behalf, I think is crucial. But Brian, over to you.
Well, I suppose I would draw attention to the issue of rights. There are lots of public rights, as it were, the ones that are written down, which are in play here. There is the right to freedom of expression, but there's also, the right to live in, healthy, autonomous ways. And I think that there are many ways in which the public does not enjoy those rights as it should. because of the behaviour of particularly the corporate national press. And I think those, I worry about, I worry obviously, and I'm sure we all do, about racism in the press. This is an infringement on the rights of substantial parts of the public. I mean, in the end, we're all part of some kind of minority. They'll get us one way or another, as it were. And I think, I worry about that, and I worry about the weakness of our capacity to protect and to resist.
Yeah, absolutely, Simon.
Yeah, well, I think in terms of when we're talking about the public, as in not abusing the public, for example, I think it should just extend to everyone. So it shouldn't be limited in terms of citizenship or nationality or even residency. It's a very broad concept. In terms of the public holding the media to account, then I think if you have a regulator such as Impress, you can make it so that it is representative of all the various communities as well. So I'm less interested in an idealized metaphor for the public, and more in terms of concrete measures for actually giving members of the public power, giving them a voice, and making sure that that it's proportional in terms of different communities and things like that.
Which obviously requires a regulator that's independent and effective and able to hold misrepresentation to account. Liz Misen, you've got your hand up in the box. Do you want to ask your question? I don't know. Can you unmute yourself and ask a question? Thanks, Liz.
I can, yes.
Great.
Anyway.
Yes.
My question was going to be, now I have to remember it. Sorry, you put me on the spot and now I've completely forgotten what I was going to ask. Can you come back to it?
Easily done.
Sorry.
Can I see that Alan Rusbridger has raised some questions. Shall I? I mean, they're directed to me.
Brian, while we're waiting.
I mean, there are 3 points there, and I mean they're all kind of addressable. The point about you think I'm wrong on the Royal Charter. Our editorials were hostile. I was hostile to the Royal Charter. But I recognised in the end, or I came to take the view in the end, that it was the least worst option, and I think the Guardian did the same. I have, in the paper in Political Quarterly, a quote: "This was the least worst option, a reasonable solution to a difficult problem." I think the Guardian came round to it, reluctantly, and that was my position too. I've skated over why so many lawyers, including the Guardians, felt the legal trade-offs involved in the Leveson compliant regulator simply didn't work. I mean, there are arguments about the terms of what was called Section 40, the precise terms, but as a simple point, this was not expressed by the Guardian at any time as the break point in the issue. It was not identified or discussed at any length in the Guardian. I would also say that in the great frame of things, for the Guardian to choose that some of the fine points of the legislation were not satisfactory, and therefore walk away, that means that having got so much of what it asked for at the Leveson inquiry, it was taking as a breakpoint some of the drafting of one of the particular aspects of the legislation. It seems to me to be allowing a feather to tip the weight in the scales against the ton of press abuses that had come before and indeed have followed since. That this is not a really substantial issue. If there had been problems with the legislation over time when it was tested, perhaps it could have been the legislation could have been amended. But the idea, which was not expressed at the time, I can't stress that enough, was not given as the reason. That seems to me to be a kind of poor service to the public, to to cling to, you know, the fine points of the drafting of the legislation, rather than accept that the spirit of the thing, and in fact, you know, the fine points were very fine. The spirit of the thing was right.
Thank you. Brian, are you back with us, Liz? Have you remembered?
I am, yes, thank you. Sorry, the little brain meltdown there. The question that I had was, it seems to me that there's a couple of flashpoints for anybody who is sort of, you know, an activist or just generally interested in improving the media generally. It seems to me there's a couple of flashpoints which have come up, especially as I've been following the Media Reform Coalition and Hacktoff's work. That sort of Leveson to and highlighting that still needs to happen. There's something there that needs to happen, and then also following up on an independent press regulator, whether that's Impress or another body. So those to me seem like the two sort of flashpoints. In terms of the panel's opinion, are there any other sort of intersections where you feel like activists and people who want to campaign for press reform, are there any other things that you think that we could be doing particularly?
Thank you, Liz. So maybe I'll start with Julian on this one. And Alan, I've noticed that you want to come back on what Brian said, and I will get you unmuted and we'll rejoin that conversation after this round. So Julian, what should we be doing now as activists?
Well, what we should be doing now as activists, in my view, as was said several times yesterday, is really supporting independent media. Things, you know, like Byline Times, for example, Open Democracy, people like that. The Guardian may not be, as some of us might wish it to be some of the time or all of the time, but it's not the be-all and end-all of everything. There is a lot out there, and it's growing, and it's very powerful. It needs to be more powerful. So I think I would really very, very strongly support what's been said thus far about supporting independent media by actually putting some money into it, by writing for it or making films for it or whatever. And you know, an awful lot of those independent media are part of Impress, and I think Impress absolutely does need supporting. And I think that thirdly, people do need to keep up the critique of the mainstream press. I mean, in particular, the kind of papers that I was talking about, the Mail, the Express, the Sun, and the Telegraph, which in my view now are barely newspapers. This is barely journalism. This seems to me to be something else. And I think that the more people who can keep up that critique, the better. I think just to say, oh, I don't read those papers, therefore they don't matter, is to completely ignore something that Simon talked about, which is the power that those newspapers have. Maybe not power over the public in the sense of individuals, but certainly power over political parties, and certainly power over political discourse. I mean, in my view, these are rivers of poison which run through the body politic, and they need to be dealt with. If we can't have proper laws dealing with this, and I completely agree with what Simon said about thinking about freedom of the public rather than freedom of the media, then we must have critique.
Simon.
Well, I've worked with Media Reform Coalition, so yeah, big up to them and Hacktoff as well. So those kind of activism and the kind of things that they propose, I think, are all very good. As Julian says, yeah, critique is very important. Critique of the rivers of poison kind of right-wing tabloids, but I think it's also important to critique the Guardian and the BBC, because people tend to trust them more. People tend to assume that they're neutral. In the case of the BBC with the Guardian, people even assume that they're left-wing. Also encouraging, again, as Julian was saying, independent, cooperative media, left-wing media. I hate to empathise with Tony Blair, but as Alan Rusbridger raised the fact that Blair had said that it wasn't fair, there was no left-wing media. We need to encourage left-wing media beyond the Mirror and the Canary and things like that. So yeah, lots of different things to attack on, I think.
And Brian.
Well, I mean, I I obviously agree with Simon and Julian. I think one thing, just my 10-year perspective, as it were, going back to the beginning of Leveson, it's worth remembering. Yes, these papers still have extraordinary power, and they created this government. They created Brexit, in my view. Yes, they have extraordinary power, but things have changed in important ways, giving the public more power. And among those is events like this. 10, 15 years ago, criticism of the press was very limited. And certainly it had difficulty finding audiences. I think that we are better placed now. We are making progress on that. I am conscious of large armies of people who feel very dissatisfied with the press, and with the state of regulation. And I think that it's easy to overlook that. So I speak of large armies. Let's stay mobilized. Let's mobilize. I mean, I think that using every power at your disposal to express your disapproval of what's going on, to identify the failures where they come, to highlight the solutions where they are there. I think that's a kind of public mission.
Thank you, Brian. I mean, I think just thinking about this from kind of my point of view, really with the Media Reform Coalition, I think whereas there are increasing opportunities for people to object to certain dominant narratives in the media, I think we should also match that with understanding the increasing concentration of ownership of news as well. We know in our latest report from MRC that 3 news organisations now, News UK, DMG, Daily Mail Group, and Reach, own 90% of newspaper circulation. I mean, that's increasing concentration, which amasses enormous power in very few hands. So yeah, we may have slight opportunities every now and again for the public to be heard, but on the whole, we've got a news landscape which is ever more increasingly dominated by very few players. And I think if we are, in answer to Liz's question from my point of view, really is one of the things we have to do is make sure that plurality and diversity of our news landscape is increased, and urgently. And that does include ensuring that those independent small media can flourish and thrive. And it also includes kind of removing some of the commercial pressures from places like The Guardian, so that they can also do independent journalism of integrity, removed from that panic about where money is going to come from in some ways. And there are mechanisms by which we can do that, but we've got to start thinking in those ways. I want to go back and bring Alan in, because I'm conscious that you didn't get a chance to respond. So please, Alan, do you want to come back in? Thanks.
Thanks, Natalie. And can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And Brian, you and I know this is one of the most obscure and tangled discussions, and probably of no interest to anybody but a tiny minority. But I wrote all those Royal Charter editorials. I mean, do send me the piece that you've got from your magazine. But the problem with the Royal Charter was not a small one. The Royal Charter is essentially it's like a sort of Henry VIII power. It's something that can be passed by the executive and it escaped the power of Parliament. So if the alternative is between a piece of legislation passed by Parliament, which we were prepared to accept and propose to Leveson in order to set up the mechanisms to create the regulator, and something which is captured by the government of the day, that's not a small difference, and that's why we were so hostile to it. The second point, again, you say it's a fine detail about libel. It wasn't to me. Now you know better than anyone, Brian, that different bits of the media worry about different bits of the law. So if you're editing a tabloid, what you're worried about is privacy legislation. I was less worried about privacy legislation because I had never in 20 years had privacy legislation used against us. I was really worried about libel because we were always being sued and risked millions and millions of pounds in enormous actions, and relied on really talented lawyers like Jill Phillips and Geraldine Proudler to fight our way through. And the situation in around about the time of Leveson was that libel was a huge threat to robust investigative reporting. And particularly local papers just couldn't afford to fight any actions at all. So that the costs issue in libel was not, I think you're being a bit unfair in saying this was a fine detail. It was actually the way that people gagged the press, much more than regulation. I don't think you're being quite fair to the arguments, though maybe we explained them or didn't explain them well enough at the time. And I think Simon is a tiny bit unfair to the Guardian Reader's Editor, which was the first attempt that I know of any newspaper in the UK to set up a channel of complaint and actually scrutiny and audit by an editor saying, look, don't complain to me, complain to someone who is independent of me, and they will have protected space in the paper. And I think that's been an interesting and really worthwhile thing to do. Ideally, one would be a member of a truly independent body as well. But again, I don't think it's something to be sniffed at. I think it's an interesting model for regulation in the future.
Simon, do you want to come back on that? Then Tim, I'm going to bring you in next if you're around. You've got your hand up.
Yeah, thank you. I think it was the Daily Mail that accused the Guardian of stupendous arrogance for talking about national security issues, but I think that's clearly very unfair. But I do think it is stupendously arrogant to think that you can yourselves set up your own independent regulator. So as you said, ideally you would also be part of an independent regulator as well. So I think that's important. But the thing about the Royal Charter as well, I think that some of the criticisms made about the Royal Charter are also unfair. So certainly I think the Royal Charter for the BBC is a disgrace and needs to be removed. But the Royal Charter for Press Regulation is not a Royal Charter of the press, newspapers. It's not even a Royal Charter for Impress, the regulator. It was a Royal Charter for the Press Recognition Panel, which recognises the independence of Impress, which then regulates the media. So it's several removes. I think it's a mistake to talk about a Royal Charter for the press. More of I don't know if it's a comment or a question for Alan.
Thank you. It's a Royal Charter framework, I suppose, rather than actually. Okay, so Tim.
Thanks. Can you hear me? Right. I don't dissent from anything that anybody says about the nature and practice of corporate media, but I do on regulation. It seems to me that the Guardian was perfectly entitled to take the decision it did. And I think it was correct, because I think that Leveson got things hopelessly messed up. And I mean, I don't want to go into all that now, but I'm interested in the point about the function of regulators. A lot of media reformers criticise IPSO for its failure to regulate, for holding press to account, but that's not its job. IPSO's job is to protect the press. Very specifically, that's what it protects its own members. And it does that by acting as a buffer between the editors and the public, and particularly people who've got complaints. It protects them very, quite deeply. If people complain to a newspaper, they get fobbed up to IPSO and mess them around for a few weeks, and eventually people get fed up or accept some measly apology. Now, in the USA, there is no media regulator. It's said to be inimical to the Constitution, at least it isn't by the overriding elite interpretation of the meaning of the First Amendment to the Constitution. But there, in America, media take complaints and the public much more seriously, and they all have readers, editors, like Alan started in Britain, and they have fact checkers. And I mean, our picture of American media is different from what it is in America. We think of it's all sensational and Hollywoodized and everything. Actually, newspapers in America are much more serious civic mind in the British newspapers. And I'd just like to put the question, what if we had no regulation at all of the content of newspapers and relied instead on a strong statutory-backed system of redressing complaints, which is the serious thing. The serious thing is what happens to people who have genuine, deep complaints against the media. So would it not be better to have no regulation at all of the content from the media's point of view, but a stronger system to protect the public who are maligned by it?
Thank you. Yeah, okay, I've got this for the panel. Brian.
Well, yeah, what you describe sounds to me like regulation. I mean, dealing with complaints is a core role of a regulator, yeah, I mean, it's easy to dismiss Leveson, but it had unique authority as a solution to the problem of structuring regulation in such a way that it did not strangle freedom of expression in the press, and I think, and it did not give politicians power over the press. I think that was a crucial element of it. And I say unique authority. This was a public inquiry held over a year, heard evidence from every available source. A very, very considered and very lengthy report, considered over 3 months by all three leading parties acting together. And the result was something that was so unanimous in the House of Commons that no vote needed to be taken in support of it. And to answer Alan's point, it came with legislation specifically designed to protect the Royal Charter from meddling by a single party in government, which was the threat. So it's not, Henry VIII is not really relevant here. But in terms of complaints, I mean, you want to see what an unregulated press looks like? That's what we've got now. IPSO is not a regulator. Regulators perform a series of functions beyond simply handling complaints. IPSO is not, but there's a kind of really significant point at this moment about IPSO, which strikes me as absolutely scandalous, which is that IPSO is in total denial. Its editor's code is in total denial about racism. It is possible under the IPSO code for racism to exist if it is a racist attack on an individual. But under the IPSO code, you can say what you like about Muslims in general, Jews in general, travelers in general, trans people in general. You can say any of that discriminatory language on a scale whatever you like. And I should add that this is the code that the Guardian uses in its own isolated, socialism in one country regulation. Its own system adopts this code. So, it is accepting this institutional racism in the editor's code. I think it's a disgrace. Tim, you ask about legislation. What kind of legislation? We had the most painstaking process to find a process to regulate the press that was independent of political interference. That's a very good model. It remains a very good model now, 10 years later. Let's do it.
Thank you, Brian. I'm conscious that we have 2 minutes left. I think the key things that have come through here is that all this, if you are going to have effective regulation, it has to be independent. And even the Guardian, doing its own readers' editors version, will always come unstuck because it's not independent. So it will always, at some point, have challenges, legitimate challenges made of it, because it will be influenced by a culture within which it works, even if it's supposed to be seen as being independent from it. I think coming back to the idea of, I'm really struck by that sense of, if we put the public first in all of our ruminations around how we can have a journalism of integrity operating independently of state and indeed independent of all of the pressures within the industry itself, then, you know, I think having the public as the key touchstone there, and the role of the voice of the public, and maybe there is a role, Tim, coming back to what you've just said, for things like a right of reply legislation to come in and strengthen the role of the public in that place outside, and maybe of the role of an official independent regulator. But we've certainly, I think, not got it right, and at the moment, and we are seriously in a state of having increasing media concentration and no effective regulation, and those press who want to can get away with saying whatever they wish, essentially, and that's a situation where media power has vastly kind of overtaken any sense of people power, and it colludes with state power, I think, at the same time, and that's a conversation that we've not yet been able to have, but hopefully the other part of the conference will pick that up. I want you to join me all in saying a huge thank you to our panelists for a very really fascinating and important discussion this morning. So to Brian, to Simon, to Julian, thank you all very much. To all the participants, I'm sorry if I didn't get to all your questions, but thank you very much for joining us, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thanks.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.